So we're continuing on our discussion of water, but we're moving from water supply and water use to water pollution. So this is chapter 18 in your book. And so the first thing we need to talk about is kind of the basics of water pollution. So what is water pollution? It's any physical, biological, or chemical change in water quality that adversely affects living organisms or makes water unsuitable for desired uses. All of that can be considered pollution. So we have two types of pollution. We have point sources. This is discharge pollution from specific locations. So we can trace the pollution back to a single point. So like a factory, a power plant, a drain, a pipe going into a river. That's a point source. We know where it's coming from exactly. Non-point sources are scattered or diffuse. They have no specific location. They're from lots of different places. So like agricultural fields, there might be fertilizer on lots of them. If that's where the pollution is coming from in our water, then it's a non-point source. Whereas if it was coming from a pipe out of a wastewater treatment plant, that would be a point source. So other examples are feedlots for livestock, golf courses, residential construction sites. These are often sporadic or ephemeral. So you might only get pollution after it rains a lot and washes stuff into the water, whereas the point sources are more likely to be occurring more year-round. So that wastewater treatment plant or that factory is probably going to be discharging water all the time that's polluted. So this shows some examples, some point sources. This is the wastewater treatment plant. This is water coming out. It's probably not going to be brown. It's probably going to be clear, but it will have probably a lot of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and potentially some pharmaceuticals that aren't very easy to pull out in wastewater treatment processes. This is a factory where we can see that the waste from the factory is coming out from a single pipe. These are point sources. All these other things are non-point sources. So we have suburban development, just things washing off of our yards. It could be, fertilizer or pesticides people use on their lawns or in their gardens. It could be oil leaking from somebody's car or mini cars that gets washed into the river. City streets have the same ideas. Any landscaping, any fluids from vehicles, any waste that gets down drains. We also have rural homes, the same idea. And then we have croplands and agricultural feedlots. As it rains and washes this stuff into the river, those are all non-point sources of pollution. So another source of, another non-point source is atmospheric deposition. And these are contaminants that are carried by air currents and precipitated into watersheds directly onto surface waters as rain, snow, or dry particles. It's estimated that 600,000 kilograms of the herbicide atrazine in the Great Lakes gets deposited from the atmosphere. So a lot of that gets moved around. There's also atmospheric nitrogen deposition. So some nitrogen falls all over the land surfaces and the water surfaces just from the nitrogen in the air. And that's not nitrogen gas, generally more like nitrous oxides. We also get contaminants can evaporate from lakes. It just depends on the type of contaminant. So like lead doesn't evaporate, but some of these organic compounds might be able to be evaporated. Other types of water pollution include infectious agents. So the main source of waterborne pathogens is improperly treated human waste, but animal waste from feedlots and fields can also be important. Coliform bacteria is an important aspect to this. These are intestinal bacteria, like if you've ever heard of E. coli, and it's used to detect contamination by animal wastes, including humans. Other examples include brain-eating amoeba and Legionnaire's disease, and there is concern about those potentially being in water supplies, but if they're properly managed, we can avoid those. In wealthier countries, sewage treatment plants and pollution control have almost completely eliminated pathogens being in the water. And we generally have good information about those. So if you get like a boil order or something like that, that generally means that there's not enough chlorine in the water to disinfect it. And, you know, different types of bacteria may be in there. And then if you boil the water, that will kill those and prevent them from harming people. So these are being closely monitored. If there are problems with it, people are alerted. Most of the time, these things are eliminated by chlorinating the water. In general, when we have waters that don't meet acceptable criteria, we will shut down. So if you ever see signs like this where swimming is prohibited, we have set limits for many pollutants of what is safe for drinking water, what is safe for swimming in, and those waters are monitored, and we change access to that water based on the pollution status. All right, another concept we need to talk about is oxygen demanding waste. So dissolved oxygen is the amount of gaseous oxygen dissolved in the water. So if you're not familiar, gases do dissolve in liquids, and so there is carbon dioxide and oxygen and nitrogen gas and all of these things dissolved in the water. And there might be organisms using that water, so we can measure the amount of oxygen in the water as to help us better understand the water quality. Oxygen does also change with the temperature of the water. Colder water can actually hold more dissolved gases than hotter water, which is kind of the opposite of what you would think, because you're probably used to like salt, where you can dissolve more salt in warmer water than you can colder water, or sugar. If you've ever tried to put a packet of sugar in your cold iced tea, it doesn't dissolve very well, whereas if it was hot, it would dissolve right away. So gases are the opposite to things like sugar and salt. They dissolve more readily in colder water. So oxygen is added to water by diffusion from wind and waves. When photosynthesis occurs, it produces oxygen, so that can also add oxygen to the water. Oxygen is removed from water by respiration and oxygen-consuming processes. Water with oxygen greater than 6 parts per million will support most aquatic life. When water becomes less than 2 parts per million, oxygen will support mainly detritivores and decomposers, and not other types of organisms. So another concept is biochemical oxygen demand. That's the amount of oxygen consumed by aquatic microorganisms. It's used as a test for organic waste contamination from sewage, paper pulp, and food waste. So basically what you do is you take a water sample and you put it in a bottle and you measure the oxygen at the beginning, and then you put it in an incubator and let it sit for a set period of time, and then you measure the oxygen again. And that tells you how much the organisms in the water used up the oxygen. And the effect of these oxygen demanding wastes on rivers really depend on the volume, the flow, and the water temperature. We do see when pollution occurs, we see something called an oxygen sag. So here we have a clean, what they're calling the clean zone. This is before the water is affected by different types of pollutants. So they're showing here, we have dissolved, if you see this as a graph, we have dissolved oxygen here. So dissolved oxygen is high, and biochemical oxygen demand is very low. I do want to point out we have certain fish that can only handle higher oxygen concentrations, represented here, like trout and perch and bass. And then another important thing is that we often use aquatic insects as bioindicators of water quality, and it's because many of them vary in how well they can handle different kinds of contaminants. And so this shows, this is a mayfly. We have This looks like a dragonfly larvae and maybe a caddisfly. And some of these different aquatic invertebrates are really good indicators of clean water, and they don't really do well if the water is poor. So in my freshwater ecology class, we learned how to identify these, and we can use these to assess the health of a stream and what the likely water quality is in different streams based on the presence or absence of these organisms. So then we see right here, we see a pipe with different outputs, some kind of, saying it's sewage, so there's going to be lots of nutrients. There might be different kinds of coliform bacteria, and the biochemical oxygen demand goes way up because there's all these microorganisms using up the oxygen, and that causes the dissolved oxygen to go down, which is this oxygen sag. And then we see that what kinds of life can live in the stream or river changes a lot. So we see these tubifex worms, which are sometimes referred to as sewage worms. They do really well in high nutrient, low oxygen conditions. They are red because they have hemoglobin just like we do, and that helps them get more oxygen out of the water. And then we see mosquitoes, and these are chironomid midge larvae. Excuse me. Mosquitoes have little siphons that allow them to breathe air, so they don't care if the dissolved oxygen in the water is very low. And chironomids often have hemoglobin just like these worms. And so they can handle these low oxygen conditions, whereas we see that all of these invertebrates and fish are now absent. They can't handle that kind of oxygen. But then we see that over time, as you get downstream, you get farther away from this sewage output. The dissolved oxygen goes up and the biochemical oxygen demand goes back down. So that's why this is called an oxygen sag, because you see it's high up here, it goes down for a bit, and then it comes back up. So this is an important thing to know about how this works. And then as the oxygen is going up, we see this recovery zone. We start to see some fish, some isopods, some leeches. They can't handle this lowest part of oxygen, but as it starts to recover, they can handle it. And then we don't get the same things as we had in the clean zone until we're much farther downstream where the oxygen concentrations have fully recovered.